I remember the moment as clearly as if it happened yesterday, the smug curl of her lips, the glint of satisfaction in her eyes as she leaned across my late son's mahogany dining table and said, "Don't expect a penny of your son's $180 million, Margaret. He made sure of that before he died." The words didn't sting, not immediately. They floated around the room, sharp yet hollow, like shards of glass suspended in air. But when they finally sank in, they sliced deep. I looked at her, my daughter-in-law, Vanessa. Dressed in black silk, her hair perfect even at my son's funeral, she exuded confidence, entitlement, and something colder than grief. My son's death had barely settled in my bones, yet she sat there discussing money like she was reading a grocery list. For a long moment, I said nothing. I just smiled, a slow, deliberate curve that must have unsettled her, because her smirk faltered. "I'm sure your lawyer will handle everything," I murmured. "Oh, he already has," she replied. "You'll get what you deserve, nothing." She stood and walked away, heels clicking like a clock counting down the seconds to her own undoing. You see, Vanessa didn't know that my son, Daniel, and I shared everything. Every secret, every regret, every plan. Even the one he never told her about. Daniel had built his fortune from scratch. Real estate, tech startups, early investments, the man had an eye for opportunity. But he also had a heart, one that had been bruised and manipulated by the woman he thought loved him. He once told me, months before his sudden illness took him, "Mom, if anything happens to me, I don't want my money to destroy what's left of our family. Promise me you'll protect what matters." I promised. And I kept that promise, in silence. The day of the will reading came. The room was heavy with perfume, polished leather, and greed. Vanessa sat front and center, dressed like a widow from a movie, all black, dramatic veil, a single tear that might have been rehearsed. Beside her, her two adult children, my grandchildren, whispered eagerly, clearly expecting the world. The lawyer, an old friend of Daniel's, adjusted his glasses and began. "To my beloved wife, Vanessa," he read, "I leave the memories we shared and the lessons learned." Vanessa straightened. The corners of her lips twitched. "That's it," she snapped. The lawyer continued, unbothered. "To my children, Ethan and Clara, I leave the freedom to choose their own paths, and a trust to ensure they never forget where they came from. The amount will be disclosed privately upon maturity." Her face flushed red. "What about the rest? What about the estate?" The lawyer paused, looked at me, then back at the crowd. "And finally," he said, "to my mother, Margaret Hayes, I leave full control of all remaining assets, including business holdings, properties, and investments, to be managed at her sole discretion." The room fell silent. Vanessa shot to her feet. "What? That can't be right." "It's quite right," the lawyer said calmly. "Daniel was very clear. Mrs. Hayes will oversee all remaining funds and properties. You'll receive a monthly allowance for living expenses, modest, as per his instructions." Her face turned a shade of crimson I didn't know humans could reach. "This is ridiculous. He wouldn't do that to me." I rose slowly, my hand steady on the polished armrest. "He didn't do it to you, Vanessa," I said evenly. "He did it for his children." She glared at me, trembling. "You won't get away with this." I smiled, not cruelly, but knowingly. "Oh, my dear, I already have." The lawyer cleared his throat. "There's one more instruction. Daniel requested that his mother continue his charitable foundation and handle all legacy donations. In the event Mrs. Hayes declines, the entire estate will be donated, none to family." Vanessa sank back into her chair, speechless. After the reading, she followed me into the corridor. Her voice shook as she hissed, "You think you've won? I'll contest this. I'll drag you through court." "Do what you must," I said softly. But Daniel knew what he was doing. She didn't know that the foundation Daniel created, the Hayes Trust for Families in Need, had one silent beneficiary: my grandchildren. A portion of every charitable project, every new investment, would one day revert to them, privately, quietly, in a way that Vanessa could never touch. Months went by. Vanessa filed suit after suit, burning money and dignity alike. She lost them all. Her lavish life began to unravel: the cars, the jewels, the invitations. The same people who once praised her for her charm now crossed the street to avoid her. Meanwhile, I continued Daniel's work. I expanded the foundation, investing in homes for single parents, education programs, and startups built by widows and veterans. I didn't tell anyone that some of those businesses quietly employed Vanessa's former friends, women who had once looked down on me at dinner parties. And my grandchildren? Ethan and Clara started volunteering with the foundation. They saw firsthand what real work looked like, what their father's money was meant to do. Slowly, they began to understand. One afternoon, Clara came to me with tears in her eyes. "Grandma," she said, "Dad trusted you for a reason. I used to think you were just, strict. But now I see it. You're the only one who never wanted anything from him." I held her hand and smiled. All I ever wanted was for him to be remembered the right way. Vanessa's last attempt to reclaim power came 2 years later. She showed up unannounced at the foundation's gala, her beauty now hollowed by bitterness. She approached me, holding a champagne glass like a weapon. "I hope you're proud," she sneered. "You took everything from me." I looked at her, truly looked. The anger, the desperation, the emptiness. "No, Vanessa," I said quietly. "You took everything from yourself." I just watched. Her hand trembled. For a moment, I thought she might throw the drink, but she didn't. She just turned and walked away, vanishing into a crowd that no longer saw her. That night, as I stood by the window of the foundation office, I could almost hear Daniel's voice. "Mom," he had said once, "don't fight fire with fire. Just build something so bright that the fire can't survive near it." I did, son. I did exactly that. And in the end, that was the sweetest revenge, not through anger, not through ruin, but through grace that outlived the greed. The years that followed moved quietly but with purpose. My life became less about vengeance and more about building something lasting, something Daniel would have been proud of. Yet I'd be lying if I said the bitterness in Vanessa's eyes didn't occasionally cross my mind. There were nights when I'd stand by the window of my home, watching the city lights flicker, wondering if she finally understood what she had thrown away: not the money, not the power, but the love of a man who truly cared for her and a family that had once welcomed her with open arms. I remembered the first time she entered our lives. Daniel was so full of hope. He brought her home for Christmas, his eyes shining with that unmistakable spark, the look of a man who believed he had found his forever. I remember her laughter that night, the way she clung to his arm, the way she called me Mom with such easy affection. I wanted to believe it was real. Maybe for a short while, it was. But greed has a way of rotting love from the inside out, doesn't it? It starts small, a suggestion, a complaint, a question about security or fairness, and before you know it, love becomes a transaction, and family becomes a business deal. After Daniel passed, I tried to keep the peace. I offered her comfort, a place to grieve, an ear to listen. But all she saw was competition. She began whispering to others that I was controlling, that I only cared about my son's money. It broke me to hear those things, but I stayed silent. I've learned, over a long life, that silence can be the sharpest weapon of all. People fill it with their own guilt. They start to hear their conscience louder when you say nothing at all. When Daniel's foundation flourished, I made sure it never became about me. It was always his name on the banners, his face in the stories, his words in the mission. But behind it all, I guided every choice. Every project carried a piece of him: a scholarship for children who lost a parent, a home for families who'd been displaced, funding for hospitals where widows volunteered. Every act of kindness was another brick in the fortress of legacy I was building, a fortress no greed could ever penetrate. And Vanessa? She faded further with each passing year. I'd hear whispers from acquaintances about her failed ventures, her desperate attempts to cling to status. She married again, briefly, to a businessman younger than her, but that too collapsed in scandal. She sold her jewelry, her cars, even the house Daniel had once gifted her. Eventually, she moved to a smaller city, away from the headlines, away from the eyes that once admired her. I didn't rejoice in her downfall. Pity, perhaps, but not pleasure. There's a difference. True revenge isn't about watching someone fall, it's about rising so high above their pettiness that they can't even reach you with their hate. One winter evening, about 5 years after Daniel's passing, I received a letter, handwritten, shaky, but unmistakably hers. I stared at it for hours before opening it. Margaret, it began, I've lost everything. I don't expect forgiveness, and I know I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know. I finally understand what you meant about love and legacy. Daniel wasn't perfect, but he was good, and I took that goodness for granted. I thought control was power. It wasn't. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything. There was no address, no signature beyond her name. I folded the letter and placed it inside Daniel's old journal, the one he used to write business ideas and little notes about life. On the last page, he'd once written, Mom always said revenge is temporary, but dignity lasts forever. I smiled through my tears that night because he was right. My revenge had never been about hurting Vanessa, it was about protecting Daniel's legacy and ensuring his name lived with honor, not scandal. It was about reminding the world that integrity could outshine greed, that quiet strength could defeat loud cruelty. A decade later, when my health began to fade, I left the foundation in Clara's hands. She'd grown into a remarkable woman, smart, empathetic, with her father's drive and my stubbornness. Ethan, too, found his way, managing the business side of things with a calm confidence that reminded me so much of Daniel. Before I passed, I gathered them both in the old office where it all began. If you remember one thing, I told them, remember this, wealth is not what you have in your hands, but what you leave in others' hearts. Your father knew that. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Clara held my hand and whispered, we won't, Grandma. We promise. And they didn't. Now, years after my death, I like to imagine the foundation still standing strong. I picture the golden plaque outside that reads, the Hayes Foundation, in memory of Daniel Hayes, built on love, strength, and grace. I imagine people walking through those doors, mothers, widows, dreamers, finding hope again. And maybe, just maybe, in some quiet apartment miles away, Vanessa sees a news story about one of our programs and feels a bittersweet smile tug at her lips. Because the truth is, revenge doesn't always look like ruin. Sometimes, it looks like legacy, like a name that refuses to be tarnished, like a light that keeps shining long after the darkness has tried to swallow it whole. And that, in the end, is the sweetest revenge of all. The years after my death unfolded like the slow turning of a final chapter, one I had written with care, line by line, ensuring every word carried the weight of truth and grace. I had lived long enough to know that the greatest victories often happen quietly, without applause or spectacle. My revenge, if you could still call it that, was never about retribution anymore, it was about peace, the kind that seeps into your bones and silences the noise of bitterness forever. My grandchildren carried that peace with them. Clara became the beating heart of the foundation, her compassion disarming even the most cynical. She visited the shelters herself, spoke to every family, every widow, every orphan who crossed their path. She wasn't doing charity work, she was restoring dignity, one life at a time. Ethan, pragmatic yet kind, handled the financial empire Daniel left behind with wisdom far beyond his years. Together, they formed a balance their father would have admired. And then one day, fate, that curious storyteller of life, decided to tie up the last loose end. It was a spring afternoon, years after I was gone. The foundation was hosting a charity gala in my memory, celebrating 20 years of growth. Reporters, donors, politicians, they all gathered under chandeliers and soft piano music, their laughter floating through the air like bubbles of champagne. Among the crowd stood a woman no one recognized at first. She was older now, her beauty weathered but not entirely gone. There was something familiar about her, a ghost of someone the staff had only heard about in stories. Clara saw her before anyone else did. The woman hesitated by the door, clutching her purse nervously, her eyes darting around as though she didn't belong. "Mrs. Moore?" Clara said softly, walking over. "Vanessa Moore?" Vanessa froze. For a moment, it looked like she might turn and leave, but then she nodded faintly. "You look so much like him," she whispered. "Like your father." Clara smiled, not bitterly, not smugly, just kindly. "You came to see the foundation?" "I wasn't sure I should," Vanessa admitted. "I heard about everything you've done. It's beautiful. Your grandmother would be proud." "She is," Clara said, her eyes glistening. "She's everywhere here. Every brick, every hand we help, she built this with her strength." Vanessa looked around, and something inside her cracked. Tears welled in her eyes, and she whispered, "I never realized how much damage I caused. I thought I was fighting for survival, but really, I was just destroying myself." Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she guided her toward a quiet corner where a framed photograph hung, me, Daniel, and the kids, smiling in front of the first Hayes Foundation building. Below it, etched into a small golden plaque, were Daniel's final words: "The measure of a person's worth isn't what they keep, but what they give." Vanessa stared at the plaque for a long moment, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch it. "He forgave me, didn't he?" she asked in a broken whisper. Clara took a deep breath. "He did. And so did Grandma. She always said forgiveness wasn't about freeing the other person, it was about freeing yourself." For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then Clara smiled faintly and said, "Come on. Let's get you something to eat. We could use more hands at the shelter this weekend if you're interested." Vanessa's eyes widened, startled by the offer. "You'd want me there?" "I think that's what she'd want," Clara said simply. And so, slowly, quietly, redemption found its way into the story. Vanessa began volunteering, not out of obligation, but out of a quiet yearning to mend what she had broken. The bitterness faded from her voice, the hardness from her eyes. People didn't know her as the woman who lost everything anymore. They knew her as the kind lady who baked cookies for the kids and stayed late to clean up. And that, I think, was the final miracle of it all, not her fall, but her rise. Because in the end, every story of revenge has a choice. You can destroy, or you can rebuild. I chose to rebuild. And through that choice, the people who wronged me learned the hardest lesson of all, that kindness can be the sharpest blade, that grace can outlast greed, and that forgiveness can finish what vengeance never could. Now, long after I'm gone, my name still lingers not in courtrooms or gossip, but in whispers of gratitude, in laughter echoing through orphanages, in the quiet moments when someone says, "Because of the Hayes Foundation, I got a second chance." And somewhere out there, I imagine Vanessa standing in front of that same golden plaque, reading Daniel's words once more, finally understanding that she hadn't lost, she had been given one last gift. Forgiveness. And that was my final, silent revenge. The sun dipped low behind the city skyline, casting a warm amber hue across the foundation's glass walls. The day's bustle had quieted, volunteers gone home, children asleep in the shelter wing, the halls now filled with only the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the soft echo of distant laughter. It was peaceful, almost sacred, as if the building itself held its breath in gratitude. Clara stood by the large portrait of Daniel, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame. She often came here at the end of the day, seeking clarity in the silent company of her father's smiling face. Behind her, she heard slow, careful footsteps, Vanessa's. They had fallen into an easy rhythm over the years. Vanessa would come by a few times a week, her hands no longer adorned with diamonds but calloused from work. She'd bring fresh flowers for the lobby, small bouquets she arranged herself. She never said much about her past life anymore, no mentions of galas, of wealth, of prestige. She spoke instead of recipes, of children who'd found homes, of how Clara reminded her so much of Daniel it sometimes hurt to look at her. That evening, Vanessa stopped a few feet away. "He looks happy there," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the portrait. "I don't think I ever made him smile like that." Clara turned, her expression gentle but firm. "He loved you, Vanessa. Even when things went wrong. He wanted you to have a chance to make things right." Vanessa nodded slowly. "And you let me. After everything I did, you could have turned me away." Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe once, that would have been satisfying. But Grandma taught us that revenge doesn't heal. Only love does." Vanessa swallowed hard, blinking away tears. She was a remarkable woman. "I wish I'd realized it sooner." "You still can," Clara said softly. "Every day you're here, you carry her work forward." The older woman looked down at her hands, rough and trembling slightly. "Do you really think she'd forgive me?" Clara didn't hesitate. She already did. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of lilacs from the garden, the same flowers Margaret had loved to plant behind the foundation decades earlier. They swayed gently under the golden lamplight, whispering secrets only the patient could hear. As the years passed, Vanessa became something of a quiet legend around the foundation. Few knew who she once was, the widow who nearly tore her family apart for fortune. To most, she was simply Miss Nessa, the kind volunteer who always made time for anyone who needed to talk. She started a small counseling program for widows who struggled with grief and anger, teaching them how to find purpose beyond loss. Ironically, she became the very thing she had once refused to be, a woman defined not by what she owned, but by what she gave. Ethan often said that if Grandma Margaret could see her now, she'd smile. Clara agreed. And somewhere, I imagine, I did. I picture myself standing in that sunlit garden, unseen but not absent, watching the women my son had loved and the grandchildren he'd raised carry the torch with quiet strength. The world I left behind wasn't perfect, but it was better than the one I'd found. The bitterness that once poisoned my family's roots had given way to something richer, something lasting. In the stillness of that imagined moment, I think of Daniel, my beautiful boy with the stubborn heart. I remember his voice, his laugh, the way he once said, "Mom, I want to build something that outlives me." And he did. We all did. That's the truth no one tells you about revenge. The kind that lasts isn't built on destruction. It's built on legacy, on the quiet satisfaction of knowing that goodness endured where cruelty failed. It's knowing that your story didn't end in hate but in redemption. So if anyone ever asks me, even from beyond this life, whether I regret not destroying Vanessa when I had the chance, I'd say no. Because watching her rebuild herself, seeing her find peace in service, was the ultimate triumph. In the end, the woman who once swore I'd get nothing from her husband's fortune became part of the very legacy she tried to erase. That's poetic justice in its purest form. And maybe that's how all stories like mine should end, not with gavel strikes or courtroom victories, but with the quiet sound of laughter echoing through a place built on love. Because forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the sharpest, most beautiful weapon of all. It's what turns dust into legacy, and legacy into eternity. Years rolled by like a soft tide, and time became both healer and witness. What had once been a battlefield of pride, greed, and betrayal was now a haven of peace. The Margaret Foundation had grown beyond anything I ever imagined. It wasn't just a charity anymore, it was a living memory, a monument to resilience. Every child who smiled there, every widow who found a reason to live again, every struggling family given a second chance, they were all pieces of the same redemption story. My story. Clara and Ethan ran it together now, each bringing a different kind of grace to the legacy. Ethan, methodical and strong, handled the structure, the funding, the logistics, a mind shaped by both his father's ambition and his grandmother's conviction. Clara, on the other hand, was the heart. She knew every volunteer by name, every donor's reason for giving, every child's dream. Watching them work side by side was like watching Daniel live again in two forms, his compassion split into two beautiful halves. Vanessa never missed an anniversary of the foundation's opening. Every year, she'd come with her small bouquet of white roses, Daniel's favorite, and place them quietly by the memorial plaque at the entrance. She never asked for attention, never gave speeches, never sought forgiveness out loud. But her presence spoke more than words ever could. There was humility in the way she moved now, a gentleness that came only from surviving one's own mistakes. She no longer dressed like the woman who once believed diamonds defined her worth. She wore simple clothes, worked with her hands, and smiled often, though sometimes her eyes betrayed a lifetime of regret. And yet, I forgave her long before she ever asked. Maybe I forgave her for myself, because holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I learned that too late in life, but not too late for my legacy. I wanted my children and grandchildren to see that strength wasn't in retaliation, it was in rebuilding what others tried to destroy. Revenge, I realized, isn't always about getting even, sometimes it's about ensuring the story ends better than it began. On what would have been Daniel's 70th birthday, the family gathered at the foundation for a small ceremony. Ethan stood by the podium, addressing a crowd of friends, donors, and staff. His voice was calm but full of pride. He spoke not just of the past, but of the future, about expanding the foundation into rural areas, about scholarships for underprivileged children, about a world his father once dreamed of. Clara stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, tears glistening in her eyes. When the speeches ended, the lights dimmed, and a short video began to play. It was a montage of memories, old home videos, family photos, moments that time hadn't managed to steal. Daniel laughing as a child. Margaret teaching him how to plant flowers. Vanessa and him dancing on their wedding day. The kids' birthdays. Then, near the end, a photo appeared of me, sitting by Daniel's hospital bed, holding his hand, smiling faintly through my tears. The caption read, "For every ending, there's a beginning born of love." The audience grew silent. For a moment, it felt as though Daniel himself was there, his laughter echoing faintly through the hall. And in that silence, I felt it, not sorrow, not regret, but peace. The kind of peace that only comes when every wound has been acknowledged, every grudge released, and every loss transformed into purpose. After the ceremony, Vanessa approached Clara and Ethan. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I never deserved this," she said softly. "Not the forgiveness, not the chance to stand here. But I'm grateful you gave it to me." Clara took her hand gently. "You earned it by what you've done since, Vanessa. Grandma used to say, people aren't defined by their mistakes, but by how they make things right afterward." Vanessa nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Then I hope she's proud." Ethan smiled faintly. "She is. We all are." The night ended with laughter and music drifting through the hallways. The younger generation, Daniel's great-grandchildren, ran around with ribbons, unaware of the heavy history that had once weighed on their family. They didn't know of the bitterness, the greed, the betrayal. They only knew love, warmth, and belonging. And that was the true victory, to leave behind not a legacy of pain, but of peace. If I could speak to them now, I'd tell them this: it's not the inheritance that defines you, it's the heart that carries it forward. The money, the estates, the assets, they fade. But kindness? Forgiveness? Legacy? Those outlast even time itself. That dusty briefcase of mine that once held old papers and worn memories. It sits now in the Foundation's archives, a symbol of how one small act of faith can change the course of generations. Inside, there's a note I left behind years ago, one that Clara keeps framed in her office. It reads, "When you are wronged, do not seek to destroy, seek to rebuild. The greatest revenge is a life lived with purpose, and a heart that refuses to hate." And with that, the circle of my story was complete. What began in betrayal ended in redemption. What started with greed concluded with grace. In the quiet after all the storms, the name Margaret didn't stand for anger or loss. It stood for forgiveness, for family, and for the unbreakable truth that justice without mercy isn't justice at all. That, in the end, was my true inheritance to them all. As the years passed, my health began to wane, but my spirit never did. I spent my mornings sitting on the veranda of the Foundation's main building, watching the sunrise wash over the fields where children played. The laughter that once seemed foreign to me now felt like music, a melody composed by redemption itself. Nurses and volunteers would stop by with tea, always greeting me with smiles and stories of the lives being changed because of the Foundation. Every time I heard about a family given a new home, a child gaining an education, or a mother finding hope after loss, I felt Daniel's presence. He was in every act of kindness, in every grateful smile. Sometimes, Ethan would sit beside me, quietly watching the horizon. He had his father's contemplative nature, a man of few words, but when he spoke, it carried weight. "Grandma," he said one evening, as the sun painted the sky gold, "you know, I used to think justice meant revenge. I wanted to make Vanessa pay for what she did. But now, I see it differently. Maybe real justice is giving goodness to the world that took something from you." I smiled faintly. "You've learned what took me decades to understand. Justice is not about evening the scales, it's about tipping them toward grace." He nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the fire of the sunset. "You did that, Grandma. You turned pain into purpose." I reached over, resting my hand on his. "No, Ethan. We did. And that's how I knew the legacy would outlive me. They didn't need my guidance anymore, they carried my lessons in their hearts. When I eventually passed on, I knew I'd be leaving behind something far greater than wealth or property. I'd be leaving behind a movement. A continuation of a story that began with loss but ended with light. Years later, long after I was gone, the Foundation's 50th anniversary would be celebrated in that same hall where Daniel's memory once echoed. Clara, now silver-haired but radiant, would deliver the opening speech. Behind her, a large portrait of me, painted by one of the orphans who'd grown up in the Foundation, would hang proudly on the wall. Beneath it, a plaque would read, "Forgiveness is the bridge between justice and peace." The crowd that gathered that night wasn't made up of investors or socialites like in my younger days. No, it was filled with teachers, nurses, students, and families who had once been recipients of the Foundation's kindness. They weren't there because of money. They were there because of love. After the ceremony, Clara would step outside into the evening air, her granddaughter, my great-grandchild, running up to her, clutching a tiny replica of that old briefcase. "Grandma," she'd ask, "is it true that this little box changed everything?" Clara would smile, kneeling down to meet her eyes. "It didn't change everything, sweetheart. The person who opened it did." The little girl would giggle and hug her grandmother's neck tightly. "Then I want to change the world too." And in that moment, the legacy would live on, not in the walls of the Foundation, not in the money or the documents, but in that small child's heart. The story that began with betrayal would continue as a story of hope, carried forward by generations who never knew the pain, only the love that came after it. If there's one thing I've learned in my lifetime, it's this: people often think revenge means making someone suffer. But the truth? The greatest revenge is peace. It's waking up every morning knowing you took every broken piece life gave you and built something beautiful from it. It's smiling at those who once wronged you, not because they deserve forgiveness, but because you deserve freedom. So, if you ever find yourself betrayed, left out, forgotten, or mocked, remember my story. Don't waste your energy plotting destruction. Instead, build. Create. Forgive. Because in the end, those who try to bury you will live long enough to see that you were a seed all along. And when they do, they'll realize, you didn't just survive. You thrived. You turned pain into purpose, and silence into legacy. That's not just revenge. That's victory. Years later, as time folded in on itself like the pages of a well-worn book, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened, the heartbreak, the betrayal, the humiliation, and eventually, the rebirth. I had seen every version of human nature, from greed to guilt, from cruelty to compassion. And somewhere along that winding road, I discovered that pain doesn't just destroy, it refines. It carves away everything unnecessary until only the truth remains. There were moments, late at night, when I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea, staring out at the city lights, and think about Daniel. About how differently things might have been if he'd lived longer, if Vanessa hadn't been blinded by ambition, if our family hadn't been tested by greed. But then I'd remind myself that without those dark turns, we would never have found the light we now stood in. Every scar, every tear, every cruel word spoken in anger, they all became the raw materials for the life we rebuilt. I came to understand that sometimes, destiny doesn't give you the life you want, it gives you the one you need to grow into who you were meant to be. In the years that followed, the Margaret Foundation flourished beyond anything I could have imagined. It became a network that stretched across continents, touching lives I would never meet, healing wounds I would never see. And though I was no longer there to witness it, I knew my spirit lingered in every act of kindness done under that name. The foundation became more than just a family legacy, it became a philosophy. A belief that love can outlast loss, that integrity can outshine greed, and that forgiveness is the ultimate act of power. Ethan would go on to become a speaker, traveling the world to share our family story, not to glorify our suffering, but to show others what comes after. His speeches were filled with raw honesty, the kind that pierces through cynicism and lands directly in the heart. Clara, ever the nurturer, continued running the day-to-day operations, refusing to let the foundation lose its soul to bureaucracy. And Vanessa, once the embodiment of selfishness, spent her final years working as a mentor for young widows. Her voice carried the tremor of a woman who had seen the worst of herself and chosen to rise anyway. But the moment that would forever be etched in the family's memory came decades later, when the foundation opened its 100th shelter. It was named the Hale House, in honor of Daniel's middle name. During the opening ceremony, a journalist asked Clara why she continued her grandmother's mission even after so many years. Clara smiled, her eyes soft with the wisdom of a woman who had lived through generations of transformation. Because my grandmother taught me something precious, she said. That revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers, through kindness, through forgiveness, through quiet persistence. She showed me that we don't win by destroying others, we win by refusing to let their cruelty destroy us. The crowd fell silent, and for a long, beautiful moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees, as if even the earth itself was pausing to listen. In that silence, generations of struggle, pain, and redemption converged into one eternal truth, that the human heart is strongest not when it hardens, but when it learns to stay soft after being shattered. And so, the story came full circle. What began as a tale of greed and grief became one of compassion and courage. The dusty briefcase that once symbolized loss had become a beacon of purpose. Its story lived on in every person the foundation helped, in every child who grew up knowing kindness instead of cruelty, in every woman who found her strength again after despair. When people now spoke of the Hale family, they didn't talk about the scandal or the inheritance or the betrayals. They talked about hope. They talked about healing. They talked about the incredible power of one person's decision to rise above hatred and choose grace instead. And maybe that's the real ending, or rather, the beginning. Because the truth is, stories like mine don't end with a single act of revenge or redemption. They live on in the choices others make after us. They become echoes, resonating through time, reminding the world that dignity is not something given, it's something reclaimed. So if my story finds its way to someone lost in their own heartbreak, let it serve as proof: no betrayal can bury you unless you choose to stay underground. Let them think they've taken everything, because what they'll never realize is that your greatest strength is born the moment you lose it all. And when you rise again, with grace in your heart and peace in your soul, you don't just win, you transcend. That was my final lesson, my quiet victory, my ultimate revenge. Even after my time on this earth had passed, the echoes of that lesson continued to ripple outward like waves on still water. The story of what had once been a fractured family became something greater, a legend whispered in classrooms, recited in speeches, remembered in moments of quiet reflection. It wasn't the money, nor the mansion, nor even the foundation that made it endure. It was the spirit behind it, the transformation of bitterness into beauty, of pain into power. In the years following my death, Ethan and Clara continued to carry the torch, but what they built surpassed even my wildest imagination. The Margaret Foundation expanded into over 40 countries, each branch bearing a plaque with the same inscription: "When the world takes everything from you, build something that cannot be taken." The phrase became our family's creed, passed from generation to generation, not as a warning, but as a promise. Ethan's daughter, Sophie, would grow up hearing bedtime stories not about fairy tale princes or castles, but about her great-grandfather's courage and her great-grandmother's strength. She learned early on that the heroes in her family didn't wear crowns, they wore humility. When she turned 18, she announced that she wanted to travel to the very first orphanage the foundation ever funded, the one that bore my name. Ethan took her there himself. The building, once modest and plain, was now bright and full of life. The walls were painted with murals, smiling faces, outstretched hands, fields of golden light. Sophie walked through the hallways in silence, taking it all in, until she reached a framed photograph on the wall. It was one of me, standing beside Daniel, taken decades ago. Beneath it, someone had placed a quote I had written long ago: "Do not let betrayal turn you cruel. Let it teach you the worth of kindness." Sophie touched the frame gently and whispered, "Thank you, great-grandma." Later that evening, as the sun sank low over the horizon, Ethan sat beside her on the steps outside the orphanage. "You know," he said, "your great-grandmother didn't set out to build an empire. She just wanted to make sure no one else felt the kind of pain she did. But that's how the most powerful things begin, small, honest, and from the heart." Sophie smiled, her eyes bright with the same quiet fire I once saw in Clara. "Then I'll do the same," she said. "Not because I have to, but because I want to." And in that moment, Ethan saw what I had always hoped for, that the strength we forged through suffering would become love in the hands of those who followed us. That our story, which began in conflict, would end in compassion. Long after that day, long after the world had changed in ways none of us could have imagined, my family continued to honor that legacy. There were new challenges, new betrayals, new tests of faith, as there always are, but they met them differently now. With grace. With patience. With the unshakable understanding that revenge isn't a single act, it's a life well lived despite the odds. And somewhere, perhaps beyond time itself, I watched them, the generations I never met, the children and grandchildren of those I loved most, and I smiled. Because the truth, the one thing I had learned after a lifetime of loss and renewal, was this: the deepest revenge isn't in making others pay. It's in living so fully, so fearlessly, that no one's betrayal can touch your peace again. When my story is told, I hope they remember me not as the woman who was wronged, but as the woman who refused to stay broken. I hope they understand that power isn't in the inheritance of wealth, but in the inheritance of wisdom. And I hope, above all, they keep building, keep forgiving, and keep believing that love, real, stubborn, defiant love will always outlast hate. Because in the end, that's what my story was really about. Not the money. Not the betrayal. But the rebirth. The quiet, unstoppable rebirth of a soul that refused to die in the dark. And if that isn't the truest kind of revenge, I don't know what is. And so, my story ends not in vengeance, but in peace, the kind of peace that comes only after you've walked through fire and chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes. Life taught me that no betrayal, no cruelty, no greed can truly defeat you unless you let it. People may take your money, your home, your comfort, but they can never take your will to rise again. That is your true inheritance. The day my family gathered for the 75th anniversary of the Margaret Foundation, the air was filled with laughter, music, and light. Children danced on the same ground where my tears once fell. The walls that once echoed with pain now carried stories of hope. My portrait hung quietly in the corner of the hall, not as a symbol of revenge, but as a reminder that love, when wielded with patience, is the greatest power of all. Clara stood on the stage, her voice trembling with emotion as she spoke to the audience. My grandmother taught us that strength isn't found in anger, she said softly. It's found in choosing kindness when the world gives you every reason to hate. She showed us that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's freedom. And because of her, thousands of lives have been changed. The applause that followed wasn't for me, it was for what we became. For a family reborn from the ruins of greed and pride. For a legacy that turned pain into purpose. For generations who understood that revenge doesn't always mean destruction. Sometimes, it means healing louder than the hurt. And as the lights dimmed and the celebration faded into the night, I could almost hear Daniel's voice again, warm, familiar, filled with love. You did it, he whispered in my memory. You turned our ending into a beginning. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: when the world betrays you, don't strike back with cruelty. Strike back with creation. Build something so pure, so powerful, that it outlives every wound they left behind. Because one day, they'll look at what you've made, and they'll see that your peace was the greatest revenge of all. That's how I chose to end my story, not with fury, not with regret, but with grace. My heart, once heavy with loss, became light again. My legacy was no longer about wealth or inheritance, but about resilience, the kind that whispers through generations. They tried to break me, but I became unbreakable. And that is how peace, not revenge, became my final victory.